The Remedial Herstory Project is a nonprofit working to get women's history into the primary and secondary history curriculum. To help us meet our goal, we produce media, lesson plans, and so much more. You can check it out on our website, www.remedialherstory.com. Our project is funded through grants and by patrons, potentially like you. Thank you to our patrons, Jeff, Barbara, Brooke, Christian, Kent, Jenna, Nancy, Megan, Leah, Mark, Nicole, Alicia, Katya, Michelle, Jessica, Laura, Jackie, Annabelle, Dawn, and Megan. If you would like to join these wonderful people and become a patron, you can head over to patreon.com and become a supporter of the Remedial Herstory Project. You too can help us reform education and allow women to be seen, heard, and complicated.
Hey, Kelsey.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell them what's happening in today's episode?
In this episode, we are going to be airing a recording from our Summer Educators Institute last year in 2021, where we had Elizabeth DuBrulle, who works for the New Hampshire Historic Society, join us.
Great.
To teach us about New Hampshire women in the suffrage movement.
Awesome.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsey Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
In this episode, we're going to be asking the question, who were the New Hampshire women in the suffrage movement? We are joined on this episode by Elizabeth DuBrulle, and I'm so excited to share this information with everybody because Elizabeth DuBrulle did this research herself. It is original research.
Okay.
She spent the year leading up to the centennial of women's suffrage digging through New Hampshire archives to try to find anything that she could find on the New Hampshire suffrage movement. It was really hard to do original research. You couldn't Google it.
Right. You gotta go dig through archives and find pieces of information and our firsthand accounts.
Yeah.
Old school newspapers.
Old school. So, first of all, I'm just so impressed with her and so grateful that she did this research so that other people can know about the women. The New Hampshire suffrage movement sort of reflected the national movement at large.
Cool.
And so I think it is a great way for people to see, people that didn't, it's not the Susan B. Anthony's and these big names, but these battles that Anthony and Cady Stanton and Ida B. Wells and all these women are fighting is happening at local levels all the time. And New Hampshire is a small state, but the patterns are the same. And I just think it's so powerful.
Yeah.
New Hampshire suffrage, to me, what sticks out when I think about her talk is it's a husband and wife duo. And I just think that is so cool. So let's turn it over to Elizabeth DuBrulle from the New Hampshire Historic Society.
Take it away, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all today. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I just got back from vacation. Hey, Becky. Hey. Sorry. I just got back from vacation late Sunday night. And I was telling Kelsey yesterday, I did 10 loads of laundry and went to 3 different grocery stores and haven't even been to my office yet. So if my brain is still on the beach, forgive me. I know. As Kelsey mentioned, I am the Director of Education and Public Programs at the New Hampshire Historical Society. I am also the editor of the Society's magazine, Historical New Hampshire. If you're not already a member of the Society, I really encourage you to join. Anyone can join. It's only $50 a year. I'm not going to pitch you on all this, but there's all sorts of great member benefits, and we have programs and exhibitions and publications and all sorts of fun things going on. The Society has made a big commitment to supporting social studies education in the state of New Hampshire, mainly at the upper elementary level, because that's where traditionally state history has been taught. It hasn't been taught for many years. We're finding that it's been really dropped from the elementary curriculum, and we're trying to restore that. So, and I'm happy to answer questions about that later, but that isn't what you are all here to talk about with me today. So you guys are all from New Hampshire, right? No, you guys aren't? Where are you guys from? New York City. New York City. Okay. So you'll get a pass, but everybody else, is everybody else from New Hampshire? Okay. So you guys must all know your suffrage history backwards and forwards in New Hampshire, right? You know everything about suffrage? Okay. That is kind of a fake question because, to be honest, nobody knew about suffrage in New Hampshire until about a year ago. It was a huge unstudied topic. As the anniversary for the 19th Amendment approached, the New Hampshire Historical Society got together with a bunch of other organizations in the state to talk about what could we do to commemorate this anniversary. And so we met with NHPR, NHPTV, New Hampshire Humanities, a bunch of different groups, Historical Society of Cheshire County, a bunch of different groups, and we decided, well, what can we do? And we decided we put up a website under the tagline, New Hampshire Women Vote 100, that was going to list all of the activities that we all had planned for the anniversary year, 2020, which unfortunately, none of those things happened. So the society also had their own celebration in the works, and we had decided we were going to do a number of things to commemorate the anniversary. We were going to have an exhibition at our headquarters in Concord, which is right across the street from the State House. And we took as our tagline, this was the title for all of our celebration: "No longer denied, New Hampshire women win the vote." So we were going to do an exhibition. We had 2 lecture series planned, one about remarkable New Hampshire women and one about suffrage in New Hampshire specifically. We partnered with NHPTV on a special showing of The Vote, the PBS documentary, The Vote, which I hope you all saw. If not, get a copy. It's really, really great. And we worked on a special issue of our magazine. There's the cover, and I have a copy right there, about women's suffrage. The exhibition, ironically, went up on March 10th, 2020. So nobody saw it. It's still up. It's going to be up for about 2 more weeks. And we've just reopened our building in June. So there's a little window of time to see it. But it's going to get taken down because we have another exhibition going in opening October 1 called New Hampshire Now. It's a photography project about the state of New Hampshire. But instead of the exhibition, what we did was we produced a special issue of our newsletter, and we turned the exhibition into a newsletter story. And I have copies of these that I'll hand out to you guys later that you can take home because it has some great information in there. But we also found that the exhibition really wasn't the best way to tell this story about New Hampshire women and what they did. So once we started diving in, I was working on the publication. My colleague, Wes Bala, was working on the exhibition. We made a startling discovery. There was nothing written about New Hampshire women and suffrage, literally nothing. There was no article, no book, nothing. So we were really starting from scratch. I'm going to confess right here, my field is colonial America. Wes's field is 19th century art. So both of us were a little bit out of our depth, but we said, well, it's state history. We're going to dive in and see what we can learn. So it ended up being a really, really great experience. And in fact, I'm going to say this is probably one of the best things I've worked on at the Society. I had so much fun doing it. So what we found when we started looking into this, New Hampshire is not mentioned in general national histories of suffrage at all, but a lot actually happened here. And some really important things for the national movement and some really important things for New Hampshire. And it illustrated one of the points that we always make about studying New Hampshire history. New Hampshire is a wonderful, wonderful mirror of national history. Okay, our history starts of we have Abenaki history, but then we also have the Anglo settlement in 1623. We cover the whole span of American history. And we really do sort of foreshadow or reflect a lot of the larger trends that happened in the country. And so this is a great way to teach New Hampshire history, to bring New Hampshire history into your classrooms, is to make these connections about what's going on nationally and what's going on in New Hampshire. And sometimes I feel sorry for states like Idaho or Montana, because their state history textbooks start in 1850. And we've already got 200 years of English settlement under our belt by the time 1850 rolls around, more than 200 years. So Wes and I started, unsurprisingly, with the Society's own collections. We have a massive collection. We have 33,000 museum objects. We have 2 million pages of manuscripts, 250,000 photographs, just tons of stuff. And we found we had almost nothing in our collections. And although we aren't going public with this, I'll tell you privately, we think the reason for that is that the director in the early part of the 20th century was a man named Otis Hammond, very well regarded. He did amazing things for the Society. He and his wife were virulent anti-suffragists. And so they didn't collect anything from the suffrage movement. One of the few things we had was this photograph, which we just acquired in 2017. And when we started talking to other organizations and collecting organizations around the state, we realized nobody else had anything about suffrage either. In fact, this photograph got used a lot by different groups last year, or they were planning to use it before the pandemic shut everything down, because it was one of the few photographs we had. And I have to warn you, we're not even sure this is a suffrage photograph. It didn't come with much caption information. So one of the things we did is we dove into looking at this photograph. Those people are standing on the steps of the New Hampshire Historical Society. We think they were at the State House and walked over the Historical Society and posed for a picture in front of the Historical Society. We're not even sure of the date. We did all sorts of research into the length of their dresses. We did zooms on their buttons to see if we could read what their buttons say. So we were pretty sure these are suffragists in 1915, but we're not positive. So that was one of the challenge. So for us, the real issue was you have to start with just piecing together the story. As a couple of historians, we looked at what do we want to do with this? And like I said, the first thing is we just had to put together a narrative, a timeline of New Hampshire suffrage movement and the people who made a difference. Who were the players? What were the important moments? What is the story of New Hampshire suffrage? And then we were hoping we were also going to have a chance to make some deeper connections about how New Hampshire suffrage related to the national movement. And we used as our sort of base questions, and these are two perfect questions that you can use anytime you want to study something about New Hampshire history or any sort of smaller history and related to bigger things. So how was New Hampshire's experience in the suffrage movement typical for what was going on in other states? And how is it unique? How is it different? There's never one answer to that. It's always a mixture. It's always, in some ways it's typical, in some ways it's unique. From there, we dug in. We started looking at everything we could find. So we did start with general histories of the women's suffrage movement. And like I said, New Hampshire's almost never mentioned. There's only a couple of times that it appears in the general histories, but of course we made note of that. We spent a long time reading the 6-volume History of Women's Suffrage by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. What was fun about that was one of their partners, one of Stanton and Anthony's partners, was a man named Parker Pillsbury. I don't know if people know who Parker Pillsbury was. He was from New Hampshire. He was a very influential editor and social reformer in the 19th century with a substantial national reputation. Excuse me. When we pulled our copies, our 6 volumes of this series off the shelf and opened the first one, we saw that inside it had been donated to the Society by Parker Pillsbury, and he'd signed it with an attribution about how this should inform future generations. So it was really neat to get to see that connection. We looked at the Women's Journal, which was the newspaper that the suffragist newspaper came out, I think, once a week for almost the entire, from 1870 until 1920. And they would publish all sorts of little reports from around the states. States would submit their little updates. Here's what's going on in our state. So we looked at that. There were a couple of organizational histories that we looked at, things like the League of Women Voters in New Hampshire. They had published a little pamphlet, and it had a little bit about suffrage in it. The Temperance Organization, a few organizations like that. We looked at personal papers. We were fortunate that the main suffragist in New Hampshire was a woman named Armenia White. And in 2014, her papers have been donated to the society. So we looked at her correspondence. She wrote and corresponded with all the big names. And then we also looked at New Hampshire newspapers, which, if you've ever done any sort of newspaper research, is a very tedious job. With all that, we managed to piece together a narrative, and we think that it's the only narrative, as far as we know, of suffrage in New Hampshire to date. We will also say, though, we have just scratched the surface. So if there are any budding graduate students out there, this is a great topic. This is a great topic with lots more to do and to look at. So one of the things I included, or that I put copies for you guys, is the preface from the magazine. It's 2 short pages, but it kind of gives you an overview about what we found and what New Hampshire's contributions were. So I'll hand that out afterwards as well. So what we found a lot of places where where New Hampshire history and national history connected, where they really intersected, and New Hampshire made a difference. And I'm going to go into some stories here in just a minute. But on the left, you'll see I've listed a bunch of sort of big moments in the national suffrage story. And then on the right, I've listed New Hampshire women who played a big role in those big turning points, those big movements. And the way we decided to structure this was by biographies. So we looked at a number of New Hampshire women and picked the ones that we thought lined up the best as sort of a jumping off point to talk about the history, and then dove into their histories a little bit. When we started this project, Wes and I both thought, oh my gosh, what in the world are we going to say? We have nothing to say. And by the time we finished, we were horrified that we had to leave some women out because we found so much material. So from here, I'm just going to kind of talk about some of the women, kind of piece together the story for you. And tell you about who some of these women were and what they did. And I mean this to be kind of casual. So if you guys have questions or anything, feel free to stop me and raise your hand or whatever, shout it out, and I'm happy to talk about it. Bearing in mind that I am not a women's historian, so don't hold me to account. All right, so we're going to start our story with Armenia White. Has anybody heard of Armenia White before? No. So she and her husband, Nathaniel White, if you are ever in the Concord area, you might have heard of them. White Park is named after them. White Opera House. The congregation, or the Unitarian Church in Concord, was once named the White Unitarian Church. They were very wealthy. Nathaniel, her husband, he was a stagecoach driver, and through a bunch of alliances with other stagecoach drivers in New Hampshire, they ended up founding a company that became American Express after they sold it. But I mean, they owned it for a long time. They made a lot of money off it. They sold it for a lot of money and eventually became American Express, which didn't used to be a credit card. It was actually an express service that got messages and packages and mail places. So they made a lot of money. They lived in Concord in the middle of the 19th century. Armenia White was the big suffragist figure in New Hampshire history, and she dominated the New Hampshire movement for the entire second half of the 19th century. After the Civil War, they were always involved in reform causes. They were abolitionists before the war. They were interested in temperance before the war. After the war, and I think Susan Ware already covered a lot of this yesterday about how the movement split. In the years after the Civil War were very tumultuous. There was a lot of contention. Should we push for African-American voting rights for men? Should we push for suffrage for both men and women of both races? What should we do? The movement split. Nathaniel and Armenia were in Boston at a meeting that was the founding of the New England Women's Suffrage Association. And they had people like Lucy Stone, who becomes a huge name in the women's suffrage movement in the 19th century. And they decide, we're going to start state organizations. We're going to organize this from the ground up. And the whites say, we're going to take care of New Hampshire. We'll found the New Hampshire organization. So they come back. This is in December of 1868. And they put out a call and to hold a meeting in Concord in December. And hundreds of people show up, and they form one of the first state suffrage organizations in the country. And they are very active in it. The whites are really an example of the power of personality. Both of them were very dynamic. They had a huge house that was right across the street from the State House. If you ever go into Concord and you know where the state annex is, right across from the State House, that's where their house used to be. They tore down their house to build the state annex in the late 1930s. They knew everyone. They were extremely well connected. And through a lot of this sort of political schmoozing, having people over for dinner, calling in favors, they managed to get suffrage on the legislative agenda. So in 1870, they make a bid, the whites and their organization, they make a bid to change the New Hampshire state constitution to remove the word male from the voting restrictions. It's one of this whole effort to change state constitutions is a big one that nationally, and this is one of the earliest efforts for it. It looks like it's going really well. They start holding public meetings. They bring in speakers from the national movement, like Lucy Stone and Mary Livermore, some of the other big figures. They have a huge turnout of people who are interested in this. This goes to a committee of the House. There's a bill that's proposed. It gets sent to a committee. The committee listens to all this testimony. They love it. Everything's going great. And then in a big shocking twist, it comes out of the committee and the committee votes inexpedient to legislate. So the effort dies and it's a huge loss. They're very upset and they don't try and change the Constitution, the state constitution, for another 30 years after that in any serious way. So the whites regroup, and this is sort of the story of women nationally. They're constantly trying something, they get close, it goes against them, they regroup, they get back together and say, okay, we're either going to try this again or we're going to figure out a different approach and go at this a different way. And they're constantly doing this over and over again. So the whites regroup, they start building alliances. So they both get very involved in the temperance movement, which had always been kind of one of their reform movements, but they decide this is a natural alliance. Okay, temperance is this movement to control the sale of alcohol. And it's very, very popular at the end of the 19th century, mainly because women get involved. Women see it as, or society sees it as, women are the ones who are bearing the cost of men getting drunk. Okay, because their husbands are drinking away their salaries, so their families are living in poverty. Their husbands are more likely to beat them or treat them badly physically. So this temperance becomes this big women's movement and this big effort that women get involved in. Actually, more women were involved in temperance at the end of the 19th century than in suffrage. So Armenia founds the New Hampshire women's temperance movement in the mid-1870s. And Nathaniel gets involved as well. They start building alliances. They reach out to women's clubs, which are just starting to form in a few New Hampshire towns, which are groups of women who they are intellectually bright. They want to do more with themselves than be housewives, and they want to develop their sort of cultural and intellectual potential. So they start forming women's clubs at this time period. So, and she's bringing in speakers. She's having all these conversations via letter with Susan B. Anthony is her main correspondent, but they're bringing in speakers to New Hampshire to raise public awareness about suffrage as an issue. Most people in New Hampshire, to be honest, didn't really care. Okay, there wasn't strong opposition because a lot of people didn't really think it was a viable possibility. They're like, whatever, we don't think it's going to happen. So there's no sense getting upset about it. Very, very quietly in 1878, they push a bill through the legislature that grants women school suffrage, which means women can vote in the state of New Hampshire on issues relating to the schools. So they can vote, they can serve on a school board, they can vote for the school board, they can vote for the school budget.
What's interesting about that is that when you read national history,
it was a source of frustration to us that we would find these great things happening in New Hampshire and there's nothing about it at the national level. It's really been forgotten. But this was a big deal. New Hampshire was the first Eastern state to adopt school suffrage. And it was considered a logical extension of women's role, right? Who has more right to say what their children should be doing than women? So there was a sort of extension of this motherhood idea. So it becomes a really big deal. And I'm going to read you a quote here from the Boston Globe covered the first election in which women could vote. And by tradition, we don't know this for sure, but by tradition in Concord, Armenia was the first woman to cast her ballot once this law had been passed. Okay, so the Boston Globe is reporting on this momentous day when women are voting in very condescending terms. So people are in a room casting a ballot, dropping their vote into the ballot box. And the Globe says the crowding, squeezing, and pushing were severe enough for the taste of the masculine voter and were harsh enough to make it extremely unpleasant for the dear creatures who were undergoing so much to cast their maiden vote. To add to the delay, the Honorable Nathaniel White had planted his somewhat corpulent form directly in front of the ballot box and stayed the surging tide to shake hands with every woman who voted. So this is a big moment, and they think Armenia White and her allies, they think this is it. New Hampshire is going to be the leader. We're gonna break through now. And so they make this big effort to get municipal suffrage, right? So that women can vote in town elections and town affairs. They start gearing up for that in like the early 1880s. And in 1881, Nathaniel dies very suddenly. He has congestive heart failure. We think it's congestive heart failure. He dies and Armenia kind of falls apart. They've got adult children who are all going through a number of issues, some financial, some emotional. So she's trying to deal with this. She's devastated at the loss of her husband because they were very, very close. And the movement kind of peters out in the 1880s. She just can't quite hold it together. So it's a sad story. And it isn't just down to her, but the other people, they can't get the momentum going for municipal suffrage. And they get it in front of the legislature, and the legislature does what it always does, and it stalls, and it stalls, and then eventually it just sort of dies away. So New Hampshire's at the forefront for this moment, and then it kind of falls back, and other states move forward. By the 1890s, she's pretty elderly at this point. She's kind of lost her momentum on this. And in fact, one of the things that we found, which was really neat, was the generational aspect of this movement. None of the women who started the bid for women's suffrage in the 1850s and 1860s lived to see the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Sometimes their daughters took up the standard for them. One case was Lucy Stone, who was a good friend of Armenia White's. Her daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, becomes a national leader. And at one point she writes a letter to Armenia, which is really very charming. But she says she's trying to get Armenia, this is in the 1889, she's trying to get Armenia to organize a meeting. And she says, I think it is very desirable to have the New Hampshire WSA stirred up a little, at least enough to hold a meeting. She ends her letter to Armenia by saying, my mother thinks it would be a good plan. And one of the pictures we found in here, this is very richly illustrated, was a wonderful picture of Lucy Stone holding a baby, and that baby is Alice Stone Blackwell. So Armenia sort of steps aside by the 1890s, and she turns over, the movement kind of languishes, and then right after the turn of the century, the movement reforms itself and starts up again. Armenia becomes what they called a revered pioneer. And she comes out for various events and gives an inspirational speech and becomes the sort of source of pride for the movement. While that's going on, there's actually something else happening in New Hampshire suffrage. So if you know anything about New Hampshire suffrage, the one suffragist you probably know in New Hampshire, does anybody know who? No, Marilla Ricker? Has anybody ever heard of Marilla Ricker? She was a lawyer. She was one of the first lawyers in the country. So Marilla Ricker she also lived in the late 19th century in New Hampshire. She was from Dover. She wasn't really involved in the state movement very much, but she did a couple of interesting things. One is, as Kelsey pointed out, she was an attorney. She was one of the first lawyers in the country. And she trained in Washington, D.C. with Belva A. Lockwood, who was the first lawyer, a woman lawyer in America. And Marilla Ricker was one of the first people to be recognized to try cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. She was very involved in sort of breaking professional barriers for women. At one point, she was very well connected politically. And at one point she was being considered for an ambassadorship, and she would have been, if she'd gotten it, she would have been the first woman ambassador in American history. Unfortunately, she didn't get it. They decided to appoint a man instead. But Marilla Ricker, so in addition to these professional boundaries, she also took a different approach to suffrage in New Hampshire. In 1870, she showed up at Dover for the town meeting at the polls and said, "I am a taxpayer and I am going to vote." And there was a big kerfluffle, and all the supervisors of the checklist are having a fit, and nobody knows what to do. They end up letting her vote, but not counting her ballot. And every year after that, she shows up at those polls again and again and again and votes, and they never count it. But that's her argument. I am a taxpayer and I should be allowed to vote. So other women in America were starting to adopt the same tactic, but she was one of the first. She might have been the first, but we're not sure. It was very close. So that's what she pushes ahead on. And in 1910, she actually runs for governor of New Hampshire. She was the first woman to run for governor, even though she could not vote. So she runs for governor. Her campaign doesn't get too far. She's very well connected with Republicans in the state, and other Republicans come to her and convince her to withdraw her candidacy eventually. But she is considered, really a pioneer. This is her portrait that now hangs in the New Hampshire State House. In the 1990s, the New Hampshire legislature they voted to allow her portrait to be put up in the New Hampshire State House. There's very few women portraits in the New Hampshire State House. So they voted to let her portrait be put up, but they didn't put any money to it because, this is New Hampshire. So it didn't go anywhere. In 2013, they passed another bill that said, okay, we'll let her portrait be up. They still didn't put any money to it. But by this point, the Women's Bar Association and the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire had stepped forward and said, we're going to take care of the fundraising. We'll raise the money and get this up. So that's what happened. Those two groups organized the money and managed to put her portrait up. When Jean Shaheen was elected in 1997, the first woman governor of New Hampshire, she remembered Marilla Ricker in her inauguration speech. And she said, just briefly, she said, her story is a reminder that change doesn't come by waiting, it comes from acting. So it's nice to know that this figure, at least, is remembered in New Hampshire.
The Remedial Herstory project is hosting its second annual Summer Educators Retreat to help teachers integrate more women's history and literature into their curriculum. Studies show that educators currently teach women's history between 5 and 20% of the time, with 5% being the plurality. Our retreat will feature speakers from around the world and be available online and in person, and provide educators with dozens of packaged lesson plans, videos, and other tools and resources to get women into every unit of their curriculum. The best part is that in-person attendees will get to network and relax with peers who are passionate about working to incorporate the diverse history of half the population, all but left out of the history classroom. The retreat will take place at New Hampshire's Common Man Inn and Spa at the heart of the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the best place to be in August. The retreat will take place between August 8th and 10th. Interested people can learn more on our website at www.remedialherstory.com/summer-educators-retreat.
moving ahead. So I mentioned the movement's kind of languishing, right? End of the 19th century. Nobody's really doing anything. Nothing's happening. The national movement is also languishing. These are called, the later women suffragists will call these years the doldrums, because nothing's happening nationally. And in part, the reason that it's languishing is because of that generational aspect. The women who started this in the 1860s are getting old, and they're losing their energy. They're not quite ready to hand it over, but they can't really do anything. So by the end of the 19th century, by the 1898, 1899, they're finally convinced, okay, we have to turn this over to the next generation. So they do that nationally. And nationally, the movement comes under the leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt, and they unite the two splintered groups are united into one organization, and Carrie Chapman Catt leads it. And she decides, when she takes over, I think in 1900, I don't remember the exact year she took over, but one of her first things is she decides, we're going to go back to the states and we're going to revitalize these state organizations. So she sends this young woman named Mary Chase, who was from New Hampshire anyways, but she was starting to get active in the national movement. And she appoints Mary Chase to start to revitalize the New Hampshire state movement, and to also kind of take care of Vermont at the same time, because even less was happening in Vermont than was happening here at that time. So Mary Chase gets involved, and right away, within a year, she gets the state organization refounded. She gets tons of new members to come in, and they say, we're going to make a bid to change the state constitution. We're going to go back. There's a state constitutional convention in 1902. We're going to get them to change it, take that word male out. Now, taking that word male out wouldn't actually give women the vote in New Hampshire. It would clear the way for them to get the vote in New Hampshire. So again, they follow sort of the similar path. They bring in national speakers. In fact, Carrie Chapman Catt moves the national headquarters for the national movement to Concord. They set up an office there, and it's funded by Armenia White. She puts up the money for them to have this office. The national organization is run out of Concord, New Hampshire. They think this is it. New Hampshire's going to break this deadlock for the country, and they're going to change their state constitution, and that is going to finally get some movement happening in the East, because the East is just kind of locked down. Lots of public support, they think, for this effort. It goes to the state constitutional convention. The first question is the state constitutional convention has to decide, are we going to put it to the voters? Right? Because the way this works in New Hampshire is the constitutional convention decides what goes to the voters, and then the voters actually decide whether the constitution is going to be changed. So they start off with, it's one of many issues being covered. They are running late. It's scheduled for an afternoon, and they're running late. And so they limit discussion to an hour. And each speaker can only speak for 5 minutes. So people start speaking, and most of the speakers are in favor of this. There are two gentlemen who aren't. One is a federal judge called, what's his name? Edward Aldrich. The other is a representative from Londonderry named Rosecrans Pillsbury. They're both sort of bigwigs in New Hampshire. These two take on all comers. Everybody who speaks, one of them responds and kind of shoots them down. And after an hour, there's still too many people who want to speak. So Aldrich actually proposes, he says, let's expand the discussion. Let's go longer. So the convention agrees. They're still hammering away at this as each speaker says, women should vote, women should vote. The question really becomes, do women want the vote? They're not sure. They're really not sure if women want the vote in New Hampshire. Finally, a speaker gets up and he says, look, we can't even decide. We should let the voters weigh in on this, because this body, we can't come to a conclusion. So they actually pass it. And it's going to go to the voters. The thing was, the convention was very poorly attended that afternoon. And the next day, there is an effort to reconsider that vote. And it's very hotly contested. And the effort to reconsider the vote narrowly fails. So it goes to the voters as question 7 in 1903, March 1903. That sets off an even bigger storm, right? Now, all of a sudden, the whole country is looking at New Hampshire. There starts to appear articles in places like Colorado and Louisiana. Staid old New Hampshire might be leading the charge. That's what they keep calling New Hampshire. And again, the national leaders pour in. There's no organized anti-suffrage movement in New Hampshire. So the people who are worried about it, they called New York and Massachusetts and said, send some of your people here. So the anti-suffrage movements in those two states start pouring people into New Hampshire and arguing back and forth and back and forth. The effort goes to the voters and it fails. And so it's a big blow. They thought they had it. And they're very upset and disappointed that it didn't come through. They try again, though. 10 years later, there's another state constitutional convention in 1912. They make a big bid for it. And I forgot to mention Mary Emma Quimby. She's on the other side here. She was the secretary for the state suffrage organization. She published something called Opinions of New Hampshire Men and Women, which gathered quotes from all the sort of the leading lights in New Hampshire, senators, authors, community leaders, all in support of suffrage. So she plays a big part. She writes a letter. She handwrites a letter to every legislator in the state legislature, which, as you know, is 424 people. That's a lot of letters. She knocks on doors. She follows up her letters by going and visiting each of these legislators. In the end, they win this legislative battle, but they lose the vote. That is the furthest that the effort in New Hampshire ever gets on changing the state constitutional convention. So in 1912, though, they try again. They think, once again, we're going to do this. These, as you know, are really rough years in the national movement. Not much is happening. And like I said, the East Coast is just locked down. Nothing's changing in the East. And women are getting very discouraged. So they launch the effort again in 1912. It goes to the Constitutional Convention. And by now, though, right before the Constitutional Convention, like 3 months before, an anti-suffrage movement gets organized in New Hampshire, in Concord. This is one of the leaders. She's actually from Exeter. Her name is Frances Perry Dudley. She and her husband were virulently against suffrage. They started holding rallies. So the suffragists are holding rallies. The anti-suffragists are holding rallies. Women are being pulled in both directions. There's also a men's organization to support suffrage that forms. They hand out, we found this in our collections, our ephemera collection, a little card. You can't see it, but it's actually filled out. You would fill this out at the rally with your name and your address. And then, we would recognize this today, right? You fill out your information and then they're going to follow up with you and try and get you involved in the effort. The suffragists use this type of thing as well. They have lots of public meetings. They have dueling public sessions at the state legislature. They open the state legislature for these public meetings. One night is for suffrage. The next night is for anti-suffrage. They're arguing back and forth. It becomes pretty nasty. In the end, though, in 1912, the state constitutional convention does not pass the amendment to the voters. It doesn't get that far. And again, it's a disappointment. But part of the reason we found out was because of this man, Benjamin Kimball. And we luckily found a suitably dark and sinister portrait of him. This is also in our collection. Has anybody ever heard of Benjamin Kimball? Okay, he was the man in late 19th century New Hampshire. He ran the railroads in the state, the Boston, Maine, and the Concord and Montreal. He is responsible for organizing the construction of the state library. He talked the state into expanding the State House and building that whole back wing of the State House. We were a little conflicted because he was also responsible for raising all the money to build our building for the New Hampshire Historical Society in 1911. He was the indispensable man. He didn't hold public office himself very often, but everybody knew him. He had tons of money. He was connected to everyone. Nothing happened in New Hampshire that didn't go through Benjamin Kimball. In 1915, it comes out that the railroads get audited because they're losing money. So the New Hampshire Public Services Commission audits them. And they find out that in 1912, there's all these mysterious payments made for alcohol and food to state legislators, There's also evidence that there's payments made to a couple of individuals who it turns out are kind of lobbyists, like an early version of a lobbyist. And there's evidence that there's some sort of collusion between the Boston and Maine Railroad and Benjamin Kimball and the New Hampshire Liquor Dealers Association and the Amoskeag Mills. It was this trifecta of the three biggest industries in the state. And it turns out those three industries got together and decided they needed to defeat women's suffrage in the State Constitutional Convention of 1912. It was one of many progressive measures that was voted on that year, and they voted against all the progressive measures. They got the legislator to vote against all of the progressive measures. Now, the reason they were against suffrage was because the Liquor Dealers Association didn't want suffrage to pass because they were convinced that women would pass laws that would then make it very difficult to sell alcohol. Okay. The Amoskeag Mills didn't want women to have the vote because they were afraid that women would enact labor reforms to get children out of the factories and to make safer working conditions and shorter work days, all of which would cut into their profits. Nobody could figure out why the Boston and Maine was against women's suffrage, but they finally pieced it together. Apparently, there was a bid for a rival railroad to open in New Hampshire. And it was part of this constitutional convention. There was this rival railroad was going to get an inroad into New Hampshire. So basically, the Boston and Maine said to these other two groups, you support us on knocking down that railroad and we'll support you on suffrage. The quid pro quo. So this makes national news. Okay, this is what suffragists have always believed nationally, that there's big money working behind the scenes to undermine suffrage. So this makes national news. It sort of mirrors what's happening in some other states. In Pennsylvania, the Liquor Dealers Association actually manages to shoot down suffrage. The Southern Pacific Railroad also works against suffrage in Mexico and New Mexico and Arizona. They were unsuccessful in stopping it, but there's big money behind the anti-suffrage movement. So Kimball is sort of at the heart of this. Ironically, he was a delegate at the 1902 convention and he voted for suffrage to go to the voters. But in 1912, he wasn't a delegate anymore. It was all about business and money. So he works against it. The years after that are tough ones, right? They're tough for the national movement too, right? We know there's all sorts of setbacks in these years. New York's not passing state suffrage. If you see The Vote, that PBS documentary, they really cover this episode well. It's pretty remarkable. The night before Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated in March 1913, Alice Paul organizes for the suffrage movement this massive parade in Washington, D.C. in honor of suffrage. It's really big news. And the whole thing is like this splendid pageantry. They have floats of showing women's contribution through history. They stop in front of various federal office buildings and stage tableau of women in costumes, acting out various like prominent moments in women's history. They have hundreds of women marching by profession. And then they also have all the state delegations there. And at the very end, they have cars carrying what's called the pioneers. We think Armenia White was there. We're not sure. She was one of the last surviving women of that generation. So there were only a few left riding in these cars. So about 300,000 people turn out for this parade. Okay. The beginning goes well. It's led by this woman named Inez McCollin. She was renowned for her beauty. She was riding a white horse. She had like a toga-like flowing robe on. She's leading this charge through Washington, D.C. The beginning is all going great. Somewhere around the middle of the parade, the crowd gets rowdy. They weren't sober, first of all. There were a lot of men who were very hostile to suffrage, and some women. And the crowd really, turns into basically a riot. So they're all pushing and shoving. You can see this picture here is the beginning of the parade. You can see how many people are lined up. But they still have a nice wide path to pass through. By the time the state delegations get up there, their women are marching single file. That's all they can get through the crowd is single file. The other shocking thing about this was there were a lot of police there that day. They sided with the rioters. They were anti-suffrage. And they basically thought women were getting what they deserved. 100 people end up in the hospital after this thing happens. It is, again, shocking national news. And even some anti-suffragists are horrified by this because these are middle-class women marching, some of them marching with their daughters. And this woman over here on the left, Agnes Jenks, she was also from Concord. She had taken her daughter and some of her daughter's friends, and she ends up testifying in front of Congress. Congress immediately convenes a special investigative committee. And they end up testifying about the treatment they received. Women were beaten by the crowd. They were pulled off the floats. Their clothing was ripped. Some of them ended up with broken bones. And this was really a turning point for the national movement that, holy cow, this is wrong. I mean, suffrage, it engendered a lot of sympathy. And suffragists later said, the national leaders later said, this riot did more for the suffrage cause than anything that had happened in the previous 60 years, because more people started becoming sympathetic to suffrage when they saw the sort of treatment these women were undergoing. So Agnes Jenks testified in front of Congress, talked about how the people in the state delegation in New Hampshire, they put all the girls, the older women tried to put the younger girls in the middle and circle around them to give them some protection. It's pretty remarkable stuff. But in New Hampshire, the movement's kind of puttering along. They're holding teas. They're having car rallies. They put a map up in the State House. 2 state legislators from Lisbon make a claim. The suffragists are always floating these bills in the legislature for women's suffrage, and they never go anywhere. But 2 legislators from Lisbon make the statement that the women in their town don't want suffrage. So the New Hampshire suffrage movement says, well, let's find out. So they go to Lisbon and they conduct a survey, and they find that 90% of the women in Lisbon want the vote. So those guys were wrong. So then they started a statewide survey, and they find that all over the state, the women of New Hampshire finally want the vote. They may have been unsure about it 20 years earlier, but by 1915, they want the vote. They have to get interpreters in Manchester and Nashua because so many of the women there don't speak English. The immigrant population is so high. German is actually the most common language, but French Canadian and French is the other one. Yeah, Manchester is a sanctuary city. So there's a lot of African refugees from like Democratic Republic of Congo. There's a big Nepalese community as well. But then it was mainly Irish, French Canadians, Italians, and Germans. Before World War I, German was the largest immigrant population in the country. And German was the second most popular language in the United States before World War I. As the movement goes along, they on the national level, they decide we're going to push for a federal amendment. They'd kind of been futzing around with this. They'd never really made a lot of headway. Back in the 1880s, New Hampshire's senator actually Henry Blair was the one who for the very first time proposed a federal amendment that women should have the right to vote, but it never went anywhere. But now the national movement says we're gonna get this through Congress, and we're gonna send this amendment to the states. They make this big push in 1917. It passes the House, it goes to the Senate, and the Senate votes it down by just a couple of votes. They need 2/3, and they have a majority, but they don't have the 2/3. So the national movement targets 4 states that have senators up for re-election and says, these are the Senate seats we have to win. Massachusetts, Delaware, New Jersey, and New Hampshire. New Hampshire actually had 2 Senate seats up for election in 1918 because one of our senators died in office. One Senate seat was pretty reliably going to somebody who supported suffrage, but the other one was hotly contested. So the other New Hampshire seat is very hotly contested, and the Republican candidate is a guy named George Moses. He was the uber conservative of New Hampshire politics in the early part of the 20th century. He became a very powerful figure in the Senate. So the New Hampshire League of Women, or the Hampshire women's suffrage movement, makes a big effort to prevent Hoare from being elected. They fail. Hoare is elected, but it was a very narrow vote. When before he had a runaway, he was going to be a runaway candidate. Now they really narrowed the vote, but he does get elected. The state house considers passing a resolution that directs him that he must vote for suffrage if it comes up in the Senate. And a lot of people say that resolution didn't pass, but a lot of people wondered at the time if he would actually have listened, would have felt bound by that amendment or not, because he was so dead set against it. Luckily, the Senate picked up a couple of surprise suffrage seats in other states. And when it was looking much more favorable for suffrage when it went to Congress, but they needed Congress to get back in session. So in early 1919, Congress wasn't in session. The suffragists wanted Woodrow Wilson to call a special session of Congress. He was in Europe, working with the founding of the League of Nations at the Versailles talks ending World War I. He comes back in end of February of 1919, and he lands in Boston. And a group of suffragists go down to Boston to try and convince him to convene a special session of Congress about suffrage. Among them was a New Hampshire woman named Lois Warren Shaw. The women show up at where Wilson's going to give like a little, speech. A couple of dignitaries are there and stuff like that. And he's on a platform. They show up without a permit. They line up in front of the platform. They've got signs. They're not disruptive. They get arrested. They get arrested because there's a law in Boston and Massachusetts at that point that you can't stand for more than 7 minutes in one place without a permit. Okay, crazy. Obviously, nobody ever enforced that law, but they do here. They arrest these 20 women or something, and they take them to the Charles Street Jail, which if you go into Boston now, now it's a really hoity-toity hotel and restaurant, the Charles Street Jail. But then it was pretty bad news. And this picture, which is one of the great finds that my illustrations editor, Joan Damaris, found, of Lois Shaw and the other women, they are at the Charles Street Jail. You can see on the edge there's bars there, and they're holding up this sign. So they're about to be processed into the Charles Street Jail, and they stopped and they got this picture taken. So the women refused to pay the fine. It's a trivial fine. They refuse to pay it. And they all decide they're going to go to jail, and they're thinking about holding a hunger strike in jail. Again, this is mirroring what's going on nationally. Alice Paul and the hunger strikes that they were doing in Washington, D.C. Lois Shaw is the mother of 5 kids. Her husband, he sends her a telegram, which I guess she got in jail, that says, "Don't be quitters. I have competent nurses to look after the children." So the women don't stay in jail for very long. They only are there for a night or two, and then their families or supporters just pay the fine. They say, "We don't want you guys to go through this." They pay the fine, and the women are released. Wilson does call the special session a few weeks later. I don't know if this was it or if this is what convinced her or not, but he does call the special session. It goes to the House and it passes. It goes to the Senate and it passes. So it's finally been approved. And now it has to go to the voters. All over there's a whole strategy for the national movement to get this passed, which probably, I don't know if Susan Ware talked about any of that or not. The national women's suffrage leaders wanted this to go really quickly. They wanted the states to ratify really fast because they had really good state organizations that were up and running. And they knew that if they basically pushed it at all states at the same time, the anti-suffragists, who were not as well organized, were not going to be able to counter the movement because they were going to have to jump from state to state. They didn't have statewide organizations. So they started pushing ratification. They thought New Hampshire was a lock. But then suddenly it looked like some of these New England states weren't going to had decided they were going to sit it out. They were going to wait and see what happened nationally, and they weren't going to vote on ratification. Vermont and Connecticut, their governors announced, "We're not holding special sessions. We're not going to talk about ratification. We want to see what happens nationally," which was devastating for the national movement. New Hampshire, they're starting to go the same way. But there's also articles in the paper about New Hampshire's important role in ratification in general, the idea of ratifying the Constitution. You guys all know, right? New Hampshire's, we're the ninth state. We were the ninth state to ratify the US Constitution that put it into effect. Reporters are starting to talk about this. Editorials are starting to bring this up. We have a very significant role to play. Some people wanted us to wait and cast the critical ratifying vote. And other people are like, we can't do that. We gotta go. We gotta vote on this. Lois Shaw and 3 other suffragists show up at a meeting of the executive council and the governor. And they basically, nobody knows what happened, but they basically strong arm them into convening a special session on women's suffrage. And so they convene this special session on September 9th. It passes without any problem in New Hampshire. It passes very quickly. It passes on that same day, or September 10th, I guess, passes in the House on September 9th. It goes to the Senate on September 10th. They pass it. So that's a big relief. We were the 16th state to pass it. As you know, we needed 36 to pass. Tennessee was the final state. They cast it, they voted it, ratified it in their legislature by 1 vote. 1 vote. And apparently it was cast by a guy that they didn't expect to vote for suffrage, but he'd gotten a letter from his mother that morning, and she basically said, you should really support this. So that's how narrowly it managed to pass. Remember I mentioned the New Hampshire state constitution and removing that word male? It came up again in 1921 before the state constitutional convention that year. It went to the voters. They voted it down. It didn't get taken out of the state constitution until 1956. Okay. Nobody enforced it, obviously, because women were voting after the 19th Amendment, but it took that long until the voters of New Hampshire finally said, we can take this out of the state constitution. After all the states ratified, which is late August of 1920, there's this big rush because people want them to vote in the elections of November 1920, but they've got to get registered. And that is actually becomes a really complicated process. And my colleague in Keene, Jenna Carroll, she did a bunch of research on this for me that was really interesting. It was one of the first time when women had to register to vote. They had a big problem on getting women to use their own names. They were used to being referred to as Mrs. John Smith. And they were not comfortable. Many women were not comfortable registering as Jane Smith. They wanted to use their husband's names, which you couldn't do. There were questions about poll taxes. New Hampshire had a poll tax in 1920. Well, how was that supposed to work? Did the poll tax, was it per family, per voter? Who was going to pay that? So the state actually came in and said, we're going to waive the poll tax for 1920 because we just want these women to be able to vote. New Hampshire kept a poll tax until 1987. They renamed it because poll taxes were outlawed in 1965 through the Voting Rights Act. They renamed it something else and kept it until 1987. They had Keene, where my friend Jenna was doing her research. They had hundreds of women show up and want to vote. The other thing that had to happen to be registered to vote is you had to pass. They did like an oral exam about, are you knowledgeable enough? Can you read? Are you educated enough to vote? And this was true. They'd done this for a long time. So they had, but all of a sudden now they've got all these new women voters and they've got to process them through. So the Keene Sentinel ran a really funny article about these 2 women who had been school teachers for years and years and years. And the committee that examined them were full of their former students who were then examining their teachers to see if they could vote. And the other thing that is kind of shocking to people is that time, if you were a woman and you married a foreigner, you lost your US citizenship. So you could not vote. So in a state like New Hampshire, with all these French Canadians, there was this question then, well, wait a minute, now these women, now we have to recognize them in their own right. They should get their citizenship back, even if their husbands are not yet citizens. So there were a lot of things to work out. And then there was also a big effort to educate women. New Hampshire started one of the first citizenship schools in the country. In fact, UNH is going to be putting a plaque up to that in within the next couple of months. The League of Women Voters started these citizenship schools, and this woman, Mary I. Wood, was essential in that. And it became a model for across the country. And it was kind of the idea of the League of Women Voters. They explained to women, how the government system worked, the branches of government, traditional civics, but then they also got them informed on all sorts of issues. What do you need to know about defense? What do you need to know about, labor laws? All these different, so that women would be educated enough so that they could cast their votes.
Is that part of UNH?
It was not part of UNH, but UNH gave them the space to meet. So yeah, that was a lot of information there. And believe me, there was so much of the story I had to leave out. But it is a great story. And I think it goes to show, first of all, that New Hampshire deserves more credit than it gets, and actually played a bigger role, but also how you can always be tying in these national events to what's happening here in the state. And how it's really, New Hampshire is really a great way to introduce this to students and make it more manageable and reasonable. Students love hearing about, the kids in the London area would probably love hearing that Rosecrans Pillsbury, who was so opposed to it, was from their town. Or the kids in Lisbon are probably really interested to hear about 90% of the women in their town wanted the vote. So it's a great way to sort of make those connections with students. Okay. Well, I will pass this stuff out. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.